For years, we've been taught that great empires are built on military might and shrewd diplomacy. But what if I told you that the most feared empire of antiquity, one that made kings tremble and nations bow, was erected upon something far more sinister, pure, calculated terror? Forget the myths of benevolent rulers. We're about to uncover the story of a man who turned cruelty into an art form, intimidation into a science, and who, in less than a generation, redefined the very concept of power. You think you know the history of Assyria? Get ready to see how a single king not only conquered vast lands, but also terrorized the minds of his enemies in a way that still echoes today. This is the saga of Ashurnasirpal II, the architect of Assyrian terror. And I promise what you'll discover here will change your perception of how empires are truly forged. And if this story surprises you as much as it does me, don't forget to hit that like button so more people can uncover this fascinating knowledge. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our next deep dives into history. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching us from? Your participation helps us spread these epic narratives to even more history enthusiasts. Imagine a time when power was measured not just by towering walls, but by the echo of fear in the hearts of enemies. Long before the relentless figure of Ashurnasirpal II emerged from the mists of history, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, though already a considerable force in the Near East, found itself at a crossroads. It was not an empire in decline, but neither was it yet the machine of terror and conquest it would become under his command. The decades preceding his reign were marked by relative stability, even a certain complacency, which, for the most ambitious among the Assyrian elite, bordered on stagnation. Kings like Tukulti-Ninurta II, Ashurnasirpal's father, had dedicated their efforts to territorial consolidation and maintaining internal order, essential tasks, but ones that didn't fuel the hunger for glory and expansion that defined the very soul of Assyria. Trade routes, vital arteries for the empire's prosperity, were constantly threatened by nomadic tribes and small kingdoms operating at the fringes of Assyrian influence. This resulted in an inconsistent collection of tributes, a flow of wealth that, instead of filling royal coffers for grand projects and campaigns, was merely enough to sustain the existing structure. The economy, though robust in its agrarian base, lacked the dynamism that would come with total control over trade routes and the constant influx of war spoils. Politically, central authority in sacred cities like Ashur and burgeoning metropolises like Nineveh was at times challenged. Governors of distant provinces, tribal chieftains, and even minor vassal kings saw temporary weaknesses in central power as an opportunity to reassert their independence or, at the very least, reduce their tributary obligations. These insubordinations, though isolated, were like cracks in the empire's facade, signs of an authority that needed to be reasserted with unquestionable vigor. Militarily, Assyrian campaigns during that period were predominantly defensive. The focus was on suppressing localized revolts, securing strategic passes, and maintaining internal peace, rather than aggressively projecting Assyrian power through new conquests. The army, though well-trained and disciplined, a force that already demonstrated the tactical and technological superiority that would come to terrorize the Near East, wasn't being utilized to its full capacity for expansion. Chariots, heavy infantry, archers, and engineers were all elements of an impressive war machine, but one that was, in a way, on standby. The memory of past warrior kings, whose inscriptions told tales of shattered kingdoms and vast spoils, hovered as an unattainable ideal, a silent challenge to the successive monarchs. However, this apparent calm didn't signify intrinsic weakness. On the contrary, it allowed Assyria to consolidate its foundations. The empire possessed a reasonably effective administration, a communication system developed for the era, and a profound royal ideology, which positioned the king as the chosen instrument of the god Ashur to impose divine order over the chaos of the world. This belief, though perhaps somewhat dormant, was the flame that could be rekindled by a leader with the necessary vision and will. The capital, Ashur, despite its religious and historical significance, was no longer the ideal logistical and military center for the ambitions of an empire aiming for total domination. Its palaces, though opulent for earlier times, lacked the grandeur that a rising empire would need to intimidate and impress. The feeling of a need for renewal and a new assertion of power was latent among the military and priestly elite. They yearned for a monarch who could not only restore ancient might, but transcend all past glories, projecting Assyria as the uncontested mistress of the Near East. This was the stage for the entry of Ashurnasirpal, a prince born at this crucial juncture in Assyrian history. He was destined to inherit a strong but challenged kingdom on its fringes, yearning for a greater purpose. He would not be a king of maintenance, but rather the architect of a new era, where military discipline would be allied with unprecedented strategic cruelty, transforming Assyria into a terrifying and dominant force. The storm was brewing on the horizon, and its name would be Ashurnasirpal II. Ashurnasirpal II, whose name resonates as an omen of his future domination. Ashur is the guardian of the air, ascended to the throne of Assyria in 883 BCE. He was no meteor suddenly appearing. His ascension was the culmination of a royal lineage that, for centuries, had woven the history of Mesopotamia. Son of Cruelty Ninurta II, his father had dedicated his short reign, 890–884 BCE, to smaller-scale campaigns, focused on consolidating control over already subjugated territories and restoring Assyrian administration in areas that had become somewhat autonomous. Cruelty Ninurta II was a king of renewal, but not of great expansion, a pillar that prepared the ground for what was to come. Before him, the dynasty included names like Ashur-dan II and Adad-nirari II, monarchs who, in the 10th century BCE, had begun the Assyrian revitalization after a period of relative retraction, laying the groundwork for what would become the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This heritage provided Ashurnasirpal with an already established military and administrative infrastructure, a reasonably stocked royal treasury, and, crucially, a professional and disciplined army, the backbone of any imperial ambition. Ashurnasirpal's coronation ceremony, likely held in the ancient religious capital of Ashur, would have been an event laden with ancestral symbolism. In the presence of priests and leading nobles, under the gaze of the god's statues, he would don the royal robes and receive the insignia of power. The ritual was not just a formality, it was a divine consecration, for the Assyrian king was seen as the earthly representative of the national god, Ashur, entrusted with the sacred mission of expanding his dominion and bringing order to the world. However, while the words and rites spoke of continuity, the young king's mind was already charting a path of rupture. Ashurnasirpal had a far grander and more brutal vision for Assyria. He saw an empire that had settled for maintenance, one that had allowed its vassals to become comfortable, and its borders to be challenged by small principalities and independent tribes. For him, the greatness of Assyria could not be maintained by administration and diplomacy alone. It had to be imposed and reasserted with an overwhelming display of force. His predecessors had sown, Ashurnasirpal would reap, but with a steel scythe. He understood that past glory was merely a starting point, not a limit. For Assyria to become the true mistress of the known world, terror had to be not just a tactic, but a philosophy of governance. The first months and years of his reign would be dedicated to a meticulous assessment of the empire's strengths and weaknesses, and those of its neighbors. He would send out scouts, gather intelligence on the resources and defenses of nearby kingdoms, and probe the loyalty of his own governors and military commanders. His ascension marked the end of an era of consolidation and the beginning of a period of aggressive expansion. He would start by reasserting Assyrian authority over territories that had neglected their tributes or dared to declare themselves independent, sending clear and unequivocal messages of his new, merciless approach. Cruelty, for Ashurnasirpal, would not be an act of desperation but a calculated strategy to instill fear, which he saw as the most solid foundation for a lasting empire. His royal inscriptions, which would soon become infamous for their brutal frankness, would begin to record a new type of kingship, one that not only won battles, but systematically terrorized its enemies into complete submission. The seed of terror, planted in Assyrian warrior traditions, was about to sprout and flourish under the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, transforming the Near East into his bloody garden. When Ashurnasirpal II donned the royal mantle, the borders of the Assyrian Empire were not well-defined lines of dominion, but rather zones of tension and contention. It was a complex geopolitical landscape, a mosaic of emerging kingdoms, ancient city-states, and tribal confederations, each playing its own part in the great dance of power in the Near East. To the north, in the rugged Zagros and Taurus Mountains, flourished the kingdoms of Urartu, a powerful confederation that was rapidly gaining strength. Their natural fortifications and knowledge of a hostile mountainous terrain made them formidable adversaries. The Urartians were not merely troublesome neighbors, they posed a strategic threat, controlling vital passes and developing their own military prowess, competing for resources and influence in the border regions. The Urartian challenge would demand a vigorous Assyrian response. To the west, the region of Syria and southeastern Anatolia was a true melting pot of Neo-Hittite city-states and Aramean kingdoms. Places like Carchemish, with its rich Hittite heritage, Arpad, a vital commercial center, and Bitadini, a strategic Aramean kingdom on the Euphrates, were regional powers in their own right. They controlled trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, possessed vast agricultural and mineral resources, and their political fragmentation, while making them potential targets for Assyrian unification, also allowed them to form temporary defensive alliances against a greater threat. Many of these kingdoms, over the past decades of relative Assyrian calm, had dared to expand their own spheres of influence, openly defying Assyrian sovereignty by delaying or refusing tributes, and, in some cases, even offering refuge to Assyrian rebels or dissatisfied tribal chiefs. The presence of these independent and semi-independent kingdoms was a direct affront to Assyrian ambition for total control of the region. To the south, ancient and venerable Babylon, despite its millennial glory, was in a period of significant weakness. Its fertile plains were constantly harassed and infiltrated by nomadic Aramean and Chaldean tribes, who established their own small principalities and disputed control of resources and cities. Although Babylon did not pose a direct military threat to Assyria at the time, it held immense cultural and religious importance for all of Mesopotamia. Its control, even if indirect, was vital for Assyrian imperial legitimacy, as the king who controlled Babylon was seen as the true lord of the lands between the rivers. Access to the Persian Gulf, with its lucrative maritime trade routes, also passed through this region, making dominion over Babylon and its environs a long-term strategic objective for any ambitious Assyrian monarch. To the east, the mountainous regions and steppes were inhabited by various tribes, some of which, like the Medes and Persians, were not yet the powers they would become, but were already restless groups that could unite into dangerous confederations. The wealth in metals and horses from these regions was tempting, but the rugged terrain and the guerrilla nature of their inhabitants made conquest and maintenance of control a constant challenge. For Ashurnasirpal, these restless borders were not just a problem to be contained, they were an opportunity. Every independent kingdom, every rebellious tribe, every uncontrolled trade route represented an affront to the supremacy of Ashur, and a chance for him to demonstrate the might and ruthlessness of the new Assyrian era. The dance of power was about to transform into a violent ballet of conquest and subjugation, with Ashurnasirpal as the master of ceremonies. The ascension of Ashurnasirpal II was not an isolated event, but rather the catalyst that activated and perfected an already formidable war machine, the Assyrian army. This was not merely a collection of militias or a gathering of peasants conscripted in times of war. It was a highly organized, professional, and innovative military force for its time, honed by decades of experience in regional conflicts and an almost religious dedication to the art of warfare. Its structure comprised several layers. At the top was the king himself, the supreme commander-in-chief, whose presence in battle was not only symbolic, but crucial for troop morale and strategic direction. Beneath him, a well-defined hierarchy of generals, Turtanu, officers, Rabshakeh, and unit commanders ensured that orders were executed with precision and discipline. The heart of the Assyrian army lay in its permanent professional units, the elite troops that were constantly trained and equipped with the best materials. The infantry, composed of archers, spearmen, and shield-bearers, formed the backbone of the formations. Archers, in particular, were devastating, capable of unleashing a rain of arrows that disorganized enemy lines before the main clash. Chariots, though transitioning to lesser tactical importance with the advent of cavalry, were still a potent shock force, carrying archers and spearmen to break enemy formations. However, the great innovation and future of Assyrian shock power lay in cavalry. Ashurnasirpal II was one of the first kings to employ cavalry massively and effectively, using it to outflank enemies, pursue retreating armies, and conduct rapid reconnaissance attacks. His horsemen, riding bareback or with rudimentary saddles, used bows and spears, making them a versatile and lethal force. Logistics was a crucial aspect of the Assyrian war machine. To sustain long and distant campaigns, the Assyrian army relied on a network of forts, supply depots, and caravans that transported food, water, weapons, and equipment. The ability to move large contingents of troops across vast and sometimes hostile landscapes was a tactical advantage few of their adversaries possessed. Furthermore, Assyrian military engineering was unparalleled. They were masters in besieging fortified cities, using an impressive range of technologies: armored battering rams that destroyed walls, assault towers that allowed troops to scale defenses, and underground tunnels to undermine city foundations. Preparation for conflict involved not only constant troop training, but also the mass production of bronze and, increasingly, iron weapons and armor, a more resistant and widely available metal. Discipline was rigorous. The army operated under a strict code, with severe punishments for disobedience and generous rewards for bravery. Unit cohesion was fundamental, and training simulated battle conditions, ensuring that every soldier knew their role and could operate effectively amidst the chaos of combat. Military ideology was intrinsic to Assyrian identity. Serving in the army was a duty and an honor, and victory in the name of Ashur was the supreme objective. Ashurnasirpal, a born strategist, not only inherited this machine, but perfected it and used it with unprecedented ferocity and intelligence. He expanded recruitment, invested in new weapons and tactics, and instilled in his troops a sense of relentless purpose. The Assyrian war machine was not merely a tool of conquest. It was the physical manifestation of his king's will, ready to subjugate the known world under the banner of Ashur. At the core of Ashurnasirpal II's power, and indeed, the entire Assyrian Empire, pulsed a deep and unwavering ideology, the divine mandate of Ashur. This was not merely rhetorical convenience to justify war, but a deeply ingrained belief that permeated all aspects of Assyrian society, from the humblest peasant to the king himself. Assyria saw itself not just as one nation among others, but as the chosen land by the supreme god, Ashur, the patron deity of the eponymous city, and the head of the Assyrian pantheon. In the eyes of the Assyrians, their god was not merely a local deity. He was the personification of cosmic order, a warrior god who, through his earthly king, sought to impose this divine order upon the world, dominating the chaos represented by foreign peoples and their inferior gods. The Assyrian king, therefore, was not just a secular ruler, but the high priest of Ashur, the intermediary between the divine realm and the human world. He was the instrument, the shepherd appointed by Ashur, to guide and protect his people and, crucially, to expand Ashur's dominion over all lands. Wars of conquest were not mere territorial or economic conflicts. They were holy wars, divine crusades to subjugate the wicked and the rebellious who dared to challenge Ashur's supremacy. Every victory was proof of divine approval. Every defeat, a sign that more devotion and sacrifice were needed to appease the god's will. The royal inscriptions of Ashurnasirpal and his successors are replete with this religious rhetoric, describing the king as the beloved of Ashur, the one who executes Ashur's will, and conquests as the works of Ashur. This ideology served multiple purposes. First, it provided unquestionable legitimacy for military campaigns. No land was beyond the limits of Ashur's dominion, and no people had the right to resist his will. This belief transformed aggression into a religious duty, plunder into an offering to the gods, and the annihilation of enemies into a ritual cleansing. Second, it unified the Assyrian people. Facing a common divine objective, social and regional differences were attenuated. Everyone, from the humblest soldier to the highest court official, was a participant in a grand divine project. This internal cohesion was vital to sustain the long and brutal campaigns that Ashurnasirpal would undertake. Third, this ideology served as a tool for propaganda and intimidation. By declaring that his cruelty was the will of Ashur, the king not only justified his atrocities, but elevated them to a sacred level. The message sent to conquered peoples and those still resisting was clear. To challenge Assyria was to challenge the gods themselves, and punishment would be ruthless and divinely sanctioned. The rituals of temple consecration, prayers before battle, and offerings of spoils to the gods were integral parts of this ideological tapestry, reinforcing the belief that Assyria was destined to rule the world. Ashurnasirpal II, more than any other Assyrian king before him, knew how to manipulate and amplify this ideology of divine terror. He not only staunchly believed in his divine mandate, but used it as the supreme justification for his policies of systematic brutality, transforming the name of Ashur into a synonym for power and annihilation for all who dared oppose his will. Upon ascending the Assyrian throne, Ashurnasirpal II did not find a peaceful and fully submissive kingdom, but rather a mosaic of challenges and pockets of insurrection that would test his resolve from day one. Although his father, Cruelty II, had strived to consolidate the empire, the volatile nature of the Assyrian borders and the ambition of tribal chiefs and minor vassal kings ensured that the new monarch would not have a tranquil transition period. The need to assert his authority in an unquestionable manner was, therefore, his most immediate and pressing priority. Every rebellion, every refusal to pay tribute was not just an economic loss, but a direct affront to his legitimacy and the power of Assyria. One of the first and most significant proofs of his determination occurred early in his reign, with the revolt of Suhu and Lakke, two Aramean kingdoms located in the middle Euphrates. This region was strategic, as it controlled important trade routes and was a natural bridge to the west. The rebellion was not merely a peasant uprising, it was a coordinated attempt to break ties of vassalage with Assyria, fueled by the belief that the new king might be weak or indecisive. The rebels, relying on their city defenses and the distance from the Assyrian capital, openly defied Ashurnasirpal's power. The king's response was swift and brutal. He mobilized his army, which was still being perfected, and personally marched to the region, demonstrating that he would not hesitate to use maximum force to crush any opposition. Another source of instability came from the Hurrian and Lulu tribes in the eastern mountains, regions perennially difficult to control due to the rugged terrain and the guerrilla nature of their inhabitants. These tribes frequently raided Assyrian lands, plundering villages and disrupting routes. Furthermore, many Assyrian governors of more distant provinces, who had enjoyed a degree of autonomy in previous reigns, needed to be reminded of their total subordination. The temptation to divert tributes or act as independent lords was great, and Ashurnasirpal needed to make it clear that the era of complacency had ended. He would do this through public displays of punishment, and, if necessary, by replacing disloyal officials with men he trusted. The way Ashurnasirpal dealt with these initial challenges would establish the pattern for his entire reign. He did not just suppress revolts, he did so with a calculated ferocity, projecting an image of ruthlessness that would become his trademark. His reign's inscriptions begin to document the atrocities that would become famous: impalements, flayings, piles of skulls, and cities razed to the ground. These actions were not random. They were a deliberate psychological warfare, intended to break the spirit of resistance even before the Assyrian army reached the city gates. The message was clear to all neighboring kingdoms and potential rebels within the empire. Disobedience would result in total annihilation and unimaginable suffering. Ashurnasirpal understood that to build an empire of such magnitude, authority could not merely be imposed, but internalized through fear. These initial challenges were, for him, the first blank canvases on which he would paint the portrait of a king, whose will was law and whose wrath was the very embodiment of terror. With the crown firmly settled on his head, and a vision of an empire forged by terror and absolute obedience. Ashurnasirpal II wasted no time in sowing the seeds of his ambition. His first military campaigns, initiated as early as his ascension year, 883 BCE, were methodically directed towards the north and east, mountainous border regions that had become hotbeds of instability and insubordination. The primary objective was not merely the conquest of new territories, but the brutal reassertion of Assyrian dominion over negligent vassals and tribes who had dared to challenge the authority of Ashur. These initial expeditions were more than simple military marches. They were declarations of intent, bloody warnings that past complacency had ended, and a new era of relentless punishment had begun. One of the first directions was to the north of the Tigris, against the kingdom of Cruelty and the tribes near Lake Van, territories that had stopped paying their regular tributes. Ashurnasirpal marched with surprising speed, catching many off guard. His chronicles recount the capture of fortified cities, not through lengthy sieges, but by direct assaults and the use of intimidation tactics. The message was immediate and visible. Those who resisted were crushed without mercy. The punishments were explicit and brutal, as the king would be sure to record in his annals: impalements of leaders, dismemberments, and the systematic destruction of fortifications and harvests. Terror was a tool, and Ashurnasirpal wielded it masterfully from the very beginning. The brutality of these initial actions had a clear purpose: to spread fear and submission before the more ambitious campaigns were launched. Concurrently, or in rapid succession, the eastern mountains inhabited by the Lulu and Nairi tribes also felt the weight of his hand. These regions were notorious for their tenacious resistance and for their ambushes in rugged terrain. Ashurnasirpal did not allow geography to be an obstacle. He led his troops through difficult passes, demonstrating not only courage but relentless determination. Communities that refused to surrender were besieged, and their populations massacred or deported en masse. The land was sown with salt to prevent future cultivation, a visual and lasting symbol of Ashur's wrath. Local chiefs who had incited rebellion were captured and subjected to exemplary tortures, the details of which were meticulously recorded to be read in neighboring capitals. These initial campaigns, though geographically limited compared to what would follow, were crucial. They served as a training ground for Ashurnasirpal himself and for his army, perfecting siege tactics, coordination between different military units, infantry, cavalry, chariots, and the logistics of long marches. More importantly, they established the precedent for his reign. Assyria would not ask for tributes. It would demand them. Disobedience would be punished with a ferocity that would surpass any previous memory of violence. The fame of Ashurnasirpal, the king who impales, began to spread like wildfire, paving the way for the grander conquests he planned for the west and south. The seeds of terror had been planted, and the ancient world was beginning to feel the growing shadow of the architect of Assyrian terror. With the northern and eastern frontiers temporarily pacified, or rather terrorized, Ashurnasirpal II's gaze turned to a region of vital strategic and economic importance: the Middle Euphrates. This was the key to Western expansion and to controlling the lucrative trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Levant and Anatolia. The Aramean kingdoms of Suhu and Lache, stretching along the fertile riverbanks, had become a thorn in Assyria's side. Their audacity in challenging imperial authority was an affront Ashurnasirpal could not tolerate, especially considering they had intercepted caravans and refused to pay tribute. The Middle Euphrates campaign, dated around 879 BCE or 878 BCE, was not just a punitive action. It was a demonstration of Assyrian capability to project power over long distances, paving the way for glory and hegemony in the west. Ashurnasirpal mobilized his army with the efficiency that would become his hallmark. His royal annals describe the relentless march, crossing deserts and rivers, a logistical feat in itself. The main objective was the control of key cities like Bit-Halupe and Hindanu, Aramean power centers that served as bastions of resistance. Ashurnasirpal's strategy wasn't just brute force. It was a combination of speed, relentless siege, and, crucially, psychological warfare that preceded and accompanied his troops. Messengers sent ahead of the army carried the reputation of the king who does not forgive, describing the atrocities committed in previous campaigns. The goal was to sow terror and induce surrender even before a single blow was struck. When surrender did not occur, Ashurnasirpal's violence was unrestrained. The siege of Beit Halupa, for example, is described in shocking detail in his inscriptions. After the city was taken, the king ordered a general massacre. The heads of the defenders were piled in mounds, their bodies hung from trees, the children burned alive. "I flayed the chiefs of all who had revolted," he boasted, "and covered the pillar with their skins. Those who were not killed were blinded, had their hands and feet amputated, or were deported en masse to Assyrian lands, to be slaves and laborers in the king's construction projects." The landscape around the captured cities was systematically devastated. Fields burned, trees cut down, wells poisoned, transforming the fertile lands into a desert. The establishment of Assyrian garrisons and the imposition of loyal governors ensured that the region remained under Assyrian control. The campaign not only subjugated the Aramean kingdoms, but also secured access and safety for the trade routes extending to the Mediterranean. This victory was not just territorial, it was a massive psychological blow. Ashurnasirpal's reputation as a king who tolerated no disobedience and who was capable of inflicting unspeakable suffering was solidified. Distant kingdoms, which might have previously considered defying Assyria, would now think twice. The Middle Euphrates campaign opened the way for Ashurnasirpal's future glory, demonstrating that there were no limits to the reach of his sword, and that the will of Ashur would be imposed on the Near East, no matter the cost in blood and suffering. Among the many campaigns that defined the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, the Siege of Tela, or Tilbarsip, as it would later be known, stands out as one of the most significant demonstrations of Assyrian military might and ruthlessness. Strategically located on the banks of the Euphrates, this city, the capital of the Aramean kingdom of Bit Adini, represented one of the last bastions of resistance in northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Conquering it would not just be a tactical victory, it would be a fatal blow to the backbone of opposition in the region, opening the way for complete dominion over the river and the trade routes to the west. Ashurnasirpal, a master of psychological warfare as much as of battle, understood the symbolic weight of such a conquest. The city of Tela was formidable, protected by powerful double walls, well-manned defense towers, and a natural location that leveraged the Euphrates curves for protection. It considered itself impregnable. The leaders of Bit Adini, confident in their defenses and possibly recalling less successful Assyrian attempts in the past, refused to submit and pay tribute. This insubordination for Ashurnasirpal was a direct affront to the will of Ashur, and an opportunity to deliver one of his most spectacular and brutal displays of power. He didn't just want to take the city, he wanted to crush it in a way that would echo for generations. Ashurnasirpal mobilized what was, for the time, one of the best equipped and most experienced armies in the world. His military engineers, the finest of antiquity, were called to the task. The siege of Tela was not a hasty battle, but a meticulous and overwhelming operation. Armored battering rams were constructed and launched against the walls, their iron and bronze heads hammering the stone. Colossal assault towers, taller than the city's walls, were erected, allowing Assyrian archers and infantry to fire down on the defenders and, eventually, to scale the defenses. Meanwhile, sappers dug tunnels beneath the foundations of the walls, attempting to make them collapse. An incessant rain of arrows from Assyrian archers filled the sky, and rudimentary but effective catapults launched stones against the defenses. Resistance within Tela was fierce. The defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew the fate awaiting them should the city fall. However, Assyrian superiority in numbers, organization, and siege technology was overwhelming. Day after day, defenses were undermined, and the morale of the defenders was broken. When the city finally succumbed to the Assyrian assault, whether by a collapse of the walls or a breach, the promised horror from Ashurnasirpal was unleashed. His own inscriptions detail the massacre that followed. "I cut their throats like sheep. I impaled many of them on stakes. I flayed the skins of their leaders and covered the city walls with their skins. I burned their young men and their virgins. The fate of the survivors was slavery and mass deportation. The siege of Tela was not just a military victory, it was a triumph of psychological warfare. The fall of such a well-fortified city and the brutality that followed sent an unequivocal message to all kingdoms in Syria and beyond. Resisting Ashurnasirpal meant annihilation. The conquest of Tela opened the gates of the west for the Assyrian Empire, ensuring control of the Euphrates and the security of trade routes. The city, renamed Kar Shulmanasharade, Port of Shalmaneser, in honor of his son or a predecessor, would become an important Assyrian base in the west, a physical and terrifying reminder of the unparalleled power of the king who subjugated it. If Ashurnasirpal II was an architect, his masterpiece was the systematic imposition of terror. He understood in a way few ancient leaders before him did, that cruelty, when applied with precision and amplified by propaganda, could be a more potent weapon than any army. His psychological warfare tactics were not random acts of barbarity, but a coldly calculated strategy to break the spirit of enemy resistance even before his legions reached the city gates. He wanted his name, and the name of Assyria, to be whispered with such profound dread that the mere mention of his approach would cause immediate surrender. The primary tool of his terror strategy was documented and publicized atrocities. Unlike other monarchs who might commit acts of cruelty, Ashurnasirpal made a point of recording them in graphic detail in his royal annals and on bas-reliefs carved into the walls of his palaces. These inscriptions were not just for internal consumption, they were explicit messages for the known world. Horrific details of impalements, flayings of enemy leaders, pyramids of skulls erected before besieged cities, blinding of prisoners, and dismemberment of bodies were proudly described. "I covered the pillar with their skins," he boasted, referring to a rebel chief. This publicity of horror had a clear purpose: to instill panic. Assyrian ambassadors and spies who preceded military campaigns did not just bring demands for tribute, they carried the king's bloody reputation. Stories of cities razed to the ground, salted fields, and blood-stained rivers were spread. The idea was for the targeted peoples to have a clear understanding of what awaited them if they dared to resist. The choice of victims was also strategic. Leaders, nobles, and warriors were the main targets for the most brutal punishments, as their suffering served as an even more potent warning to their subjects. The total destruction of resisting cities was a stark example of the cost of disobedience. Beyond physical terror, Ashurnasirpal also employed mass deportations. Entire populations, men, women, and children, were forcibly uprooted from their ancestral lands and relocated to distant regions of the empire. This not only emptied rebellious territories, preventing future insurrections, but also provided slave and forced labor for the king's ambitious construction projects, such as the new capital of Kalhu, Nimrud. These deportations destroyed the cultural and social identity of conquered peoples, diluting their capacity for resistance and forcing their assimilation into the vast Assyrian machine. Ashurnasirpal II's cruelty was not random or impulsive. It was a sophisticated psychological weapon, an integral part of his military and political strategy. He used fear as officers instead of soldiers, horror as a messenger instead of pigeons. The result was an era of unprecedented submission, where entire kingdoms surrendered upon hearing the king's reputation, preferring vassalage and tribute to certain annihilation. This legacy of terror would become a defining characteristic of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and would influence how future empires attempted to control their domains. The royal annals of Ashurnasirpal II are far more than mere chronological records of his reign. They are meticulously crafted propaganda documents, designed to immortalize the image of an invincible and ruthless king. Written in cuneiform script on clay tablets, monoliths, and most prominently in inscriptions on the walls of his magnificent northwest palace in Kalhu, Nimrud, these texts serve as the primary source of our knowledge about his campaigns, and crucially, about his own ideology of terror and magnificence. Ashurnasirpal didn't just win battles, he narrated them to shape the perception of his power. The language of the annals is grand and full of superlatives. Ashurnasirpal is consistently described as the mighty king, the shepherd of Ashur, the conqueror of the land. Every victory is attributed to the divine intervention of Ashur and other gods of the Assyrian pantheon. reinforcing the idea that the king was the instrument of divine will. The narrative is constructed to impress, beginning with the list of his titles and ancestral conquests, establishing his legitimacy and heritage, and then delving into a detailed description of his military campaigns. However, what truly distinguishes Ashurnasirpal's annals from other ancient records is the frankness and detail with which he describes the atrocities committed against his enemies. He not only records victories, but revels in narrating methods of punishment. Vivid descriptions of impalements, flayings, burning of young men and women, piles of skulls and cities reduced to ashes are presented without any modesty. For example, in an infamous passage he boasts, "I made a pillar of heads in front of their city gate. I tied their young men and maidens on them, burning them. I impaled many of them on stakes." These details were not meant to shock Assyrians, who were already familiar with the brutality of war. They were, first and foremost, a form of intimidating propaganda for neighboring peoples. Copies of these annals and summaries were likely circulated among vassal kingdoms and enemies, serving as a grim warning of the consequences of disobedience. The message was clear. Resistance to the king of Ashur would result in unimaginable suffering and complete annihilation. In addition to descriptions of terror, the annals also glorified the king's architectural achievements and construction projects, especially the founding and embellishment of Kalhu, Nimrud. The construction of his palace, the exotic gardens, the zoos, and the monuments were described with the same level of detail and pride as his military campaigns. This reinforced Ashurnasirpal's image not only as a warrior, but as an empire builder, a civilizing king who brought order and prosperity, Assyrian prosperity, to the world. The magnificence of the court and the new capital was as much a part of his power strategy as the brutality of his army. In essence, the royal annals were the official voice of the empire, dictating the narrative of history. They projected an image of absolute power, where the king was the embodiment of divine will, capable of destroying and building, of terrifying and ruling. By transforming horror into glory and documenting every act of cruelty as proof of his divine justice, Ashurnasirpal II not only wrote his own history, but also set a new and terrible standard for imperial propaganda in the ancient Near East. These inscriptions, carved in stone for eternity, ensured that Ashurnasirpal's fame as the architect of terror would endure far beyond his own reign. After consolidating his dominion in northern and eastern Mesopotamia and securing control of the Middle Euphrates with the brutal campaign against Suhu and Lache, Ashurnasirpal II's gaze firmly fixed on the west. The rich and fragmented region of Syria, with its myriad of Aramean and Neo-Hittite city-states, represented an irresistible prize. It not only offered vast resources and a dense population, but, crucially, controlled the vital trade routes extending to the Levant and the Mediterranean coast. For Ashurnasirpal, control of these routes meant economic hegemony and the ability to drain wealth into Assyrian coffers. The march to the west was not a single campaign, but a series of methodical expeditions, a calculated expansion of Assyrian terror aimed at total submission. The Aramean kingdoms, such as Bitadini, with its capital in Tilbarsip already mentioned, and other principalities along the Balik and Kabur rivers, were the first targets. These kingdoms, though wealthy, were politically fragmented and lacked the unity needed to confront the Assyrian war machine. Ashurnasirpal used his characteristic tactics: speed, surprise, and terror. His army, now even more experienced and feared, advanced rapidly, besieging cities and demanding immediate surrender. The king's inscriptions detail the capture of cities like Patina, in Amuk, Carchemish, a powerful Neo-Hittite city-state, and countless others who faced the brutal choice: submission or total annihilation. The method was always the same, and the results were repeatedly horrific. Resisting cities were taken by force and their inhabitants subjected to a merciless massacre. Ashurnasirpal never tired of describing how he flayed chiefs, impaled their bodies, made pyramids of their heads, and burned their cities. These actions were not just to punish insubordination, but to send a deafening message to neighboring kingdoms. The psychology of terror was as important as brute force. Seeing the fate of their neighbors, many rulers chose to surrender immediately, offering vast tributes of gold, silver, bronze, cattle, fine textiles, and cedar wood, a valuable resource from the Levant. The conquest of these Aramean and Neo-Hittite kingdoms opened the doors to the Mediterranean. Ashurnasirpal's troops, for the first time in his reign, reached the Great Western Sea, the Mediterranean. This was a moment of immense symbolism and glory, representing the zenith of Assyrian expansion to date. On the shores of the sea, the king performed rituals and made offerings to the gods, reinforcing the idea that Ashur's dominion extended from mountain to sea. Cedar wood, vital for his construction projects in Kalhu, was obtained in abundance, forced as tribute from the kingdoms of Lebanon. The march to the west transformed Assyria from a regional power into an imperial power. The regions of Syria and Anatolia, once sources of instability, were now provinces or vassal states that provided wealth, labor, and security. Control of trade routes ensured unprecedented prosperity for the Assyrian treasury, further funding campaigns, and the grandeur of the new capital. Success in the west solidified Ashurnasirpal's reputation as a ruthless conqueror and the true architect of terror, whose power knew no geographical limits and whose wrath was the manifestation of divine will. While Ashurnasirpal II's legions relentlessly advanced westward, extending Assyrian dominion over the rich city-states of Syria, the emperor was constantly reminded that the stability of his empire depended not only on new conquests, but also on the continuous subjugation of peoples inhabiting the wilder, mountainous frontiers. Among these perennial challenges, the Lulu uprising stood out, a confederation of warrior tribes residing in the Zagros Mountains, east of Assyria. These tribes, known for their fierce independence and for using the rugged terrain for ambushes and raids, represented a constant source of instability, disrupting trade routes and plundering Assyrian villages. For Ashurnasirpal, any form of resistance was a direct affront to his divine authority and demanded a response that would not only suppress the rebellion, but also serve as a bloody, lasting warning. The campaign against the Lulu was not a new offensive, but a brutal reassertion of control over a people who refused to remain submissive. The mountains were a logistical hell for any regular army. Narrow roads, dangerous ravines, and snow-capped peaks made the march arduous and vulnerable to surprise attacks. However, Ashurnasirpal, with his characteristic determination, did not hesitate. He knew that control of the mountains was crucial for the security of the eastern borders and for access to resources like metals and horses. His troops, now hardened by countless campaigns, were trained for mountain warfare, using agile scouts and marching columns that could adapt quickly to changing terrain. Ashurnasirpal's inscriptions describe in grim detail the ferocity of his suppression. The strategy was simple: total annihilation of communities that dared to resist. Entire villages in the mountains were surrounded, their inhabitants massacred without distinction of age or gender. Those who tried to flee were relentlessly hunted down. The king boasted of having submerged the lands in blood and of having made their bodies cover the mountains like grass. The heads of rebel leaders were often piled in mounds to serve as monuments of terror, and the skins of some chiefs were used to cover city gateposts, a graphic and terrifying warning to anyone contemplating insurrection. The intention behind this brutality was not just to punish, but to crush the spirit of rebellion definitively. Ashurnasirpal did not just want submission, he wanted the annihilation of the capacity for resistance. Survivors were often mass deported to the central lands of Assyria, where they would be forcibly assimilated or used as slave labor in his gigantic construction projects. The lands of the Lulu, once fertile in some regions, were devastated, their crops burned, their trees cut down, rendering them uninhabitable and therefore less attractive for future insurrections. The Lulu uprising, while not a campaign of great territorial expansion like the March to the West, was fundamental for consolidating internal control and ensuring the security of the eastern borders. It demonstrated that Ashurnasirpal's iron fist would reach even the most remote and mountainous corners of his empire, and that resistance, in any form, would be met with unimaginable violence. The brutal suppression of the Lulu reinforced the king's reputation as a monarch who tolerated no challenge and was willing to use terror in its most extreme form to guarantee peace, a peace imposed by absolute submission. For Ashurnasirpal II, War was not merely the art of conquest, but equally crucially, the art of systematic destruction. He elevated the annihilation of his opponents to a form of imperial expression, a deliberate and calculated policy to consolidate his power. The brutality of his campaigns was not random. It was a method, a universal language of terror intended to communicate an unequivocal message. To challenge Assyria meant complete eradication. His inscriptions, instead of mitigating the cruelty, celebrated it as an act of divine justice, legitimized by the god Ashur. This approach transformed the battlefield into a stage of horrors and retaliation into a spectacle. Ashurnasirpal's arsenal of destruction was vast and applied with chilling methodicalness. Resisting cities were besieged, and once captured, subjected to an indiscriminate massacre. The entire population, men, women, and children, was slaughtered, not as a byproduct of battle but as part of the punishment. Bodies were often mutilated, decapitated, and their heads piled into pyramids or hung from trees, serving as macabre visual markers of his victory. "I made a pillar of heads in front of their city gate," he boasted, and impaled the survivors on stakes around the pillar. The repetition of these descriptions in his annals indicates that these were not isolated events, but part of a pattern of terror. Beyond direct extermination, Ashurnasirpal employed scorched earth tactics aimed at annihilating the enemy's capacity for sustenance. Crop fields were burned, orchards and vineyards cut down, and irrigation systems destroyed. The goal was to render the land unproductive, preventing survivors, or anyone who dared to repopulate the area, from recovering. This agricultural devastation was an economic and psychological blow that ensured the conquered region remained dependent on Assyrian control, and that the memory of punishment remained vivid for years. Cities, once plundered of their treasures and valuable goods, were set ablaze and demolished, often to the point of being reduced to mounds of ruins, erasing their existence from the map. The mass deportation of populations was another facet of this art of destruction. Those who survived the massacres were forced to march to the central lands of Assyria, where they were dispersed and forcibly assimilated into Assyrian society, or used as slave labor in gigantic construction projects, such as the new capital in Kalhu. This policy not only dismembered enemy communities and cultures, but also ensured there was no population base for future rebellions. Deported peoples lost their identity, their land, and their ability to organize against the empire. The public display of tortured prisoners and the imposition of grotesque punishments on rebel leaders, such as flaying and blinding, were calculated spectacles of horror designed to instill panic and submission. These images would be retransmitted by travelers and survivors, solidifying Ashurnasirpal's fame as the architect of terror and ensuring that fear preceded his armies. The art of destruction for Ashurnasirpal was not an end in itself, but a means to achieve peace, a peace enforced by the absence of any opposition. He forged an empire not only by the strength of his weapons, but by the ability to use horror as his most potent ally, ensuring that the name of Assyria would be synonymous with power and annihilation for generations to come. With the plains of Syria under his control and the Euphrates trade routes secured, Ashurnasirpal II's gaze turned to the northern and northwestern regions, entering the sphere of influence of Anatolia. There, remnants of an ancient and glorious civilization flourished, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. City-states like Carchemish, Commagene, and Arpad, though no longer a unified empire like the original Hittite one, were rich, well-fortified, and controlled strategic resources, including metals and important passes into Asia Minor. For Ashurnasirpal, the subjugation of these kingdoms was crucial to consolidate control over Syria and extend Assyrian influence into the heart of Anatolia, ensuring the flow of tributes and access to new resources. Ashurnasirpal's campaigns in Anatolia were no less brutal than his incursions into Mesopotamia and Syria. He employed the same strategy of shock and awe, combining military superiority with relentless psychological warfare. The Neo-Hittite cities, with their robust fortifications, posed significant challenges for Assyrian siege engineers, but the king's reputation often preceded his army. In several cases, the mere mention of Ashurnasirpal's approach was enough for local leaders to opt for surrender, hoping to spare their cities from the massacre and total destruction that had visited other kingdoms. When resistance, however, was encountered, the Assyrian response was devastating. Ashurnasirpal II's inscriptions detail the capture of fortress cities through advanced siege tactics, battering rams hammering walls, assault towers scaling defenses, and sappers undermining foundations. Once the defenses were breached, the Assyrian army entered, and the promised horror ensued. The king's accounts spare no details. "I made a pillar of their heads in front of their gates. I burned their young men and their virgins. I made great pyramids of their heads in the city, and flayed their leaders and covered the city walls with their skins." This display of cruelty was a form of sadistic art, calculated to instill terror and ensure that no other city in the region would dare defy the Assyrian will. Neo-Hittite kings who surrendered were forced to pay heavy tributes in gold, silver, bronze, cattle, horses, and crucially, cedar wood and other noble timbers, which were scarce in Assyria and essential for Ashurnasirpal's grand construction projects in Kalhu. These riches were transported to Assyria, fueling the imperial economy and financing future campaigns. Additionally, the imposition of Assyrian governors, or the installation of strictly controlled vassal kings, guaranteed the continued loyalty and submission of the region. The populations of the most recalcitrant cities were frequently mass deported to Assyria, where they would be resettled in agricultural lands, or forced to work on royal projects, serving both to punish and to supply needed labor. Ashurnasirpal II's iron fist in Anatolia was fundamental to solidifying Assyrian hegemony over all of northern the Near East. By subduing the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, he eliminated a potential source of resistance and secured his western borders. The campaigns in Anatolia not only expanded Assyrian territory, but also reinforced the king's image as an unmatched conqueror, whose power and cruelty knew no geographical limits. The fear of Ashurnasirpal became an effective governing tool, ensuring the submission of a vast and wealthy region. The Mediterranean campaign under the reign of Ashurnasirpal II was, in essence, the symbolic apex of his relentless march to the west. It was not a large-scale invasion to annex vast coastal territories, but rather a demonstration of force expedition that culminated in one of the most celebrated moments of his reign, the reach of the Great Western Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. This achievement represented the realization of the Assyrian vision of universal dominion, the idea that the power of Ashur extended from mountain to sea, from sunrise to sunset, encompassing all known lands. The route to the Lebanese coast passed through regions already subjugated or terrorized in Syria, making the journey more of a triumphant march than a series of major battles. After the subjugation of the Aramean and Neo-Hittite kingdoms in inland Syria, the path to the coast was clear. The Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, and others, were powerful maritime trade centers, rich in goods and with impressive fleets. These cities, which had flourished through trade and maintained relative independence due to their coastal location and their ability to maneuver among the great powers, knew that facing Ashurnasirpal's Assyrian army meant total destruction. Their prosperity and existence depended on trade, and trade required peace and stability. Instead of armed resistance, the Phoenician cities opted for strategic submission, an act of pragmatism in the face of the overwhelming force approaching. They sent ambassadors laden with precious gifts and offerings, presenting themselves before Ashurnasirpal in an act of humility and recognition of his sovereignty. The king's inscriptions proudly detail the wealth of these tributes. "I received the tribute of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Mahalatu, Maza, Kaitanu, Amuru, and Arwad, which are cities on the coast of the sea. Gold, silver, tin, copper, linen garments, cedar wood, juniper wood, ivory, sealskins, sheep, cattle." This influx of riches, especially cedar wood, which was a scarce and valuable resource in Assyria, was of immense importance for Ashurnasirpal's grand construction projects in Kalhu. The arrival at the Mediterranean was an event of profound religious and propagandistic significance. Ashurnasirpal not only collected tributes, he performed a ritual in the sea's waters, washing his weapons in the ocean. a symbolic gesture that Ashur's power had reached the ends of the known world. He sacrificed animals to the gods and erected a stele with his image and inscriptions glorifying his conquests, a landmark of his triumph. Although the Phoenician cities were not annexed as provinces, their submission and the payment of tributes transformed them into vassal states under Assyrian influence. This guaranteed Assyria continuous access to maritime routes and resources from the Levant. The Mediterranean campaign, therefore, was not a war of attrition, but an effective demonstration of power. It solidified Ashurnasirpal's reputation as a king whose dominion extended in all cardinal directions, and whose terror had compelled even the wealthy port cities to bow before his will. It was a conquest without battle, a testament to the success of his intimidation strategy. Reaching the Mediterranean marked a high point in Ashurnasirpal's trajectory, cementing his place as one of the greatest and most feared Assyrian kings, the architect of an empire that stretched from the Zagros to the sea. In Ashurnasirpal II's Neo-Assyrian Empire, military conquest was not an end in itself, but the means to establish a system of tributes and vassalage that economically enchained the conquered to Assyrian dominion. This system was the financial backbone of the empire, ensuring a constant flow of wealth, resources, and labor to Assyria, funding not only the luxury of the court, but also the incessant military campaigns and grand construction projects. For Ashurnasirpal, economic submission was as vital as military subjugation, as it ensured the permanence of Assyrian hegemony without the need to maintain an onerous military occupation in every territory. Once a kingdom or city-state was subjugated, whether by brutal force or strategic surrender, its rulers were compelled to swear loyalty, vassalage, to the Assyrian king. This oath was not a mere formality. It involved complex rituals and the invocation of gods, with promises of divine punishment for breaking the agreement. In exchange for Assyrian peace, local rulers were permitted to retain their positions, though under strict surveillance and with the presence of Assyrian garrisons at strategic points. The primary obligation of these vassals was the regular payment of tributes, a form of compulsory tax imposed on their economies. Tributes were varied and adapted to the wealth and resources of the region. Ashurnasirpal's inscriptions detail this diversity. Precious metals such as gold, silver, bronze, and tin, large numbers of cattle and sheep, superior quality horses, vital for the Assyrian cavalry, fine textiles and embroidery, spices and perfumes, and, of particular importance, cedar wood and other noble timbers from the Levant, which were essential for palatial constructions in Kalhu. The volume of these tributes was colossal, representing a significant drainage of wealth from local economies to Assyria. Refusal or delay in tribute payment was the most common pretext for a new and devastating punitive campaign by Ashurnasirpal, a demonstration that economic obedience was as rigorously enforced as political obedience. In addition to material tributes, the system of vassalage also demanded labor. Entire populations of war captives and, at times, subjects of vassal states were forced to work on the empire's construction projects, in mines, or in Assyrian agriculture. These mass deportations not only provided the necessary workforce, but also served to dilute the identity and resistance capacity of conquered peoples, dispersing them throughout the empire. The presence of Assyrian envoys and inspectors in vassal kingdoms ensured that tributes were paid and loyalty was maintained. Any sign of insubordination was quickly reported to Ashurnasirpal's court, which responded with his characteristic brutality. This system of economic enchainment allowed Ashurnasirpal to maintain a vast empire with relative efficiency. Instead of directly annexing and administering every conquered piece of land, which would have been logistically impossible and costly, he preferred to turn kingdoms into permanent sources of wealth and resources, ensuring Assyrian supremacy without the need for total occupation. This approach not only stabilized the Assyrian economy, but also spread Assyrian culture and influence, albeit coercively, throughout the Near East. The system of tributes and vassalage was, therefore, a tangible manifestation of Ashurnasirpal's terror, a peace imposed by the constant threat of annihilation, ensuring that Assyrian economic power was as vast as its military dominion. Ashurnasirpal II's military campaigns were not just about conquest and imposing authority. They were intrinsically vast operations of plunder and spoils, designed to drain wealth from conquered peoples and channel it into the heart of the Assyrian Empire. This massive influx of goods, precious metals, natural resources, and labor not only funded terror, sustaining an army always on campaign and the king's grand construction projects, but also served as a tangible reward for his soldiers and a visible symbol of Ashur's power and glory. For Ashurnasirpal, plunder was an extension of victory, a divine right granted to the conqueror. When a city was taken by force, especially those that had resisted, the first hours were of rampant looting. The Assyrian army was permitted to plunder homes, temples, and palaces, taking everything of value: gold, silver, copper, bronze, precious stones, ivory, exotic wood, elaborate furniture, fine garments, weapons, and armor from slain enemies. All were collected and added to the vast treasury of the king and his generals. Ashurnasirpal's records detail these spoils with an almost possessive pride. I took as booty great quantities of silver, gold, lead, copper, and copper vessels. I carried off their chariots, their horses, their mules. The enumeration of these goods was not merely accounting. It was a form of glorification, a testament to the wealth that Ashur had bestowed upon his king. Plunder was not limited to valuable objects. Crops and livestock were equally important. Fields were systematically plundered or burned, herds were confiscated, and the produce of these lands was used to feed the Assyrian army or sent back to Assyria. The destruction of the enemy's agricultural base not only deprived them of sustenance, but also created dependency and ensured that the region could not quickly recover to challenge Assyrian dominion. This scorched earth policy was an economic warfare tactic as brutal as direct massacres. Beyond material goods, the most valuable and, in some ways, most tragic plunder were human lives. Thousands of men, women, and children were captured and taken as war captives. These people were then mass deported to Assyria, where they would be used as slave labor in a variety of vital tasks, working in mines to extract metals, building roads and irrigation canals, cultivating royal lands to feed the growing empire, and, most importantly, erecting Ashurnasirpal's grandiose new capital, Kalhu, Nimrud. The construction of such structures required an army of laborers, and the deportees were the silent driving force behind Assyrian opulence. They were forcibly integrated into the Assyrian economy, contributing to its prosperity at the cost of their own freedom and culture. The constant flow of plunder and spoils had a transformative effect on Assyria itself. It enriched the court, allowing the flourishing of a culture of luxury and opulence. More importantly, it funded the war machine itself. The money and resources obtained from conquests were reinvested in the army, in purchasing and maintaining horses, in manufacturing more advanced weapons and armor, in troop training, and in the logistics of future campaigns. It was a vicious cycle of conquest and wealth that fed terror. Ashurnasirpal II's military success was intrinsically linked to his ability to drain the wealth of neighboring peoples, transforming plunder into a fundamental pillar of his empire and ensuring that terror was profitable. Amidst the relentless war machine and terror of Ashurnasirpal II, there were those who, against all odds, dared to offer desperate resistance. Although the vast majority of kingdoms and cities succumbed to the terrifying fame of the Assyrian king, preferring vassalage and heavy tribute to certain annihilation, some leaders and peoples chose to fight to their last breath. The sacrifice of the challengers, though almost always futile in military terms, serves as a testament to human tenacity and repulsion to the total submission imposed by the conqueror. These stories, though often told in Assyrian inscriptions to glorify Ashurnasirpal's power, reveal the ferocity of a resistance that, even if condemned, refused to be easily broken. One of the most prominent examples of this resistance was seen in fortress cities like Bit Halupe or Tela, Til Barsip. Their defenders, aware of the horrific fate that awaited them, fought with a fervor of desperation. They knew that total surrender would mean the massacre of their families, deportation, or slavery, while resistance, even if it cost their lives, might perhaps buy a little more time, or at best, inflict significant cost on the invader. Amidst the sieges, The battle cries of the Assyrians were met by the defiant shouts of the besieged. Arrows and stones rained down from the walls, and battering ram attacks were met with improvised defenses and desperate attempts to burn the enemy's siege engines. In mountainous regions, such as those inhabited by the Lulu or the tribes of Nairi, resistance took the form of guerrilla warfare. Knowing the rugged terrain, local defenders used the landscape to their advantage, ambushing in narrow defiles, attacking Assyrian supply caravans, and hiding in caves and natural fortifications. These tactics aimed to wear down the enemy, force them to operate in unfamiliar territory, and hopefully, make occupation so costly that the Assyrians would eventually withdraw. However, Ashurnasirpal was relentless. He did not give up, sending elite troops to hunt down guerrillas and devastating the land to deprive rebels of support and resources. The Assyrian response to this mountain resistance was always a brutal and comprehensive suppression. Even when the fall of a city was inevitable, many preferred to die fighting rather than surrender. There are accounts, implicit in Assyrian descriptions of massacres, of combatants who threw themselves against the Assyrian army in acts of pure suicidal bravery. These actions, though futile in terms of changing the outcome of the battle, were acts of final defiance, of asserting dignity in the face of annihilation. For Ashurnasirpal, however, such resistance, however desperate, only justified the intensity of his retaliation. The fiercer the fight, the more terrifying the punishment, solidifying the message that any challenge to his power was futile and doomed. The sacrifice of the challengers, though it did not alter the course of Assyrian expansion, left a mark on the memory of the subjugated peoples. These stories of struggle, even in defeat, echoed through generations, fueling a latent resentment that, in later eras, would surface against Assyrian dominion. For Ashurnasirpal, however, these resistances were just another opportunity to demonstrate the total and absolute invincibility of his war machine and the ruthlessness of Ashur's will. They were the necessary victims to cement the empire of terror. The policy of mass deportations was one of the most cruel and effective tools of imperial control and consolidation employed by Ashurnasirpal II, and later by his successors in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Unlike a simple plundering of goods or a massacre to punish resistance, deportation aimed to dismantle the identity of conquered peoples and, ultimately, to force their loyalty to the Assyrian Empire. It was not a new tactic in ancient history, but Ashurnasirpal implemented it on an unprecedented scale and with systematic precision, transforming it into a central pillar of his domination strategy. When a city or region was subjugated, especially those that had offered resistance or were deemed problematic, vast populations, including men, women, children, and elders, were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. Ashurnasirpal's inscriptions record the number of deported people in the thousands. While the exact figures might be propaganda, the magnitude of the operation was undeniable. These people were forced to march, often on long and arduous journeys, across mountains and deserts, toward the heartland of Assyria or to other provinces of the vast empire. Many perished along the way due to exhaustion, starvation, or disease. The primary objective of these deportations was twofold. First, they emptied problematic territories of their native populations, eliminating the base for future rebellions. By removing inhabitants from their lands, Assyria destroyed the social, political, and cultural structures that could foster resistance. Communities were dismembered, their kinship and support networks broken, and their local identities diluted. Control over these regions became much easier when the population was replaced by loyal Assyrian colonists or by other deported peoples of different origins who had no roots in the land and therefore less motivation to rebel. Second, the deportees provided an immense source of slave and forced labor. These individuals were then employed in a variety of tasks vital to the empire, working in mines to extract metals, building roads and irrigation canals, cultivating royal lands to feed the growing empire, and, crucially, constructing Ashurnasirpal's grandiose architectural projects, such as the monumental new capital of Kalhu, Nimrud, and its magnificent Northwest Palace. The construction of such structures required an army of laborers, And the deportees were the silent driving force behind Assyrian opulence. They were forcibly integrated into the Assyrian economy, contributing to its prosperity at the cost of their own freedom and culture. The deportation policy was not just about forced labor, it was a form of social engineering. By mixing peoples of different origins and languages in new regions, Assyria sought to create a more heterogeneous and less cohesive population, reducing the risk of coordinated uprisings. An Assyrian identity was imposed, and deportees were compelled to adapt to Assyrian language and customs to survive. Ashurnasirpal II perfected this tactic, transforming the removal and relocation of populations into a strategic instrument of domination. Mass deportations were one of the most visible and lasting manifestations of Assyrian terror's brutality and efficiency, leaving a deep scar on the memory of the peoples of the ancient Near East. The grandeur of the Assyrian Empire under Ashurnasirpal II was manifested not only in the scale of its conquests, but also in the sophistication of its military architecture. The Assyrians were master engineers, and this was evident in both their siege tactics and their defense strategies. They transformed the taking of fortified cities into a brutal science, combining brute force with tactical intelligence, and their innovations shaped siege warfare for centuries. The ability to breach the most robust walls was a pillar of their hegemony and a crucial component of the imposition of terror. In attack, the Assyrians developed an impressive array of siege engines. The battering ram was their most iconic weapon, a massive machine, often covered by a protective roof and on wheels, with a metal head at the tip, sometimes in the shape of a ram, hence the name. These machines were operated by teams of soldiers and could continuously pound enemy walls until a breach was created. To protect the operators, the battering rams were armored with leather or metal, making them resistant to arrows and projectiles. Complementing the battering rams, colossal assault towers were mobile wooden structures, taller than the city walls. They allowed Assyrian archers to fire from an elevated position over the defenders, and once positioned, served as bridges for infantry to storm the city. Sapping and mining were other devastating tactics. Assyrian engineers dug tunnels beneath the city walls, undermining their foundations to cause the collapse of the structure or to allow the infiltration of troops. This was a dangerous operation and required great skill and coordination. Additionally, the Assyrians were adept at building earth and rubble ramps up to the walls, allowing their troops to scale them or for their battering rams to reach higher points. The massive use of archers, who unleashed a constant shower of arrows to suppress the defenders, was crucial for all these siege operations, forcing enemies to take cover while the machines and sappers did their work. In defense, the Assyrians were also ingenious. Their own cities and forts were built with multiple layers of walls, moats, bastions, and projecting towers, allowing defenders to fire on attackers from various angles. The walls were made of massive mud bricks, and at times reinforced with stone. The fortification system of their new capital, Kalhu, Nimrud, for example, was a testament to this defensive expertise, with imposing double walls that made it virtually impregnable to direct attacks. Strategic passes and borders were dotted with a network of fortresses and garrisons that served as warning points, supply bases, and control centers to maintain order in the provinces. Ashurnasirpal II invested heavily in the capabilities of his military engineers and in the production of siege equipment. The descriptions in his annals and the reliefs in his palace show these machines in action, glorifying Assyrian technological superiority and their ability to overcome any defense. Assyrian military architecture under Ashurnasirpal was not just about building and destroying. It was about projecting power and terror, ensuring that no enemy could feel safe behind their walls when the architect of terror decided to march. The core of Ashurnasirpal II's power, and the primary tool for expanding his empire of terror, was the Assyrian army, a military force that, in its era, was virtually invincible. It was not only the largest army in the region, but also the most professional, technologically advanced, and disciplined. Ashurnasirpal not only inherited this war machine, but perfected it, making it the vanguard of his brutal campaigns and the physical manifestation of his relentless will. The composition, training, and organization of this army were the pillars of its invincibility. The foundation of the Assyrian army comprised permanent professional troops, soldiers who dedicated their lives to military service. These were supplemented by contingents from vassals and, notably, by elite corps such as the 10,000, a unit of heavy infantry that resembled the Persian immortals in its organization and effectiveness. The infantry was diverse. Archers formed the largest contingent, armed with composite bows capable of firing arrows with great penetrating power and range. They operated in dense formations, unleashing hails of projectiles that disorganized enemy lines before close-quarters combat. Alongside them, spearmen and swordsmen, protected by full-body shields and scale armor, formed the front line, ready for the clash. However, the great innovation and tactical differential under Ashurnasirpal was the large-scale use of cavalry. While many armies still relied on chariots, which the Assyrians also used, though with decreasing importance, Ashurnasirpal invested heavily in mounted cavalry units. His cavalrymen were horse archers and lancers who could conduct rapid flanking attacks, pursue retreating enemies, and act as effective scouts. This mobility and shock power gave the Assyrians a decisive tactical advantage over less adaptable armies. Syrian military engineering, already detailed, was an integral part of the army's strength. Engineer units were experts in building bridges, siege ramps, battering rams, and assault towers, and in undermining walls. Their ability to overcome any enemy fortification was a key element in Ashurnasirpal's conquest strategy. Logistics was also impeccable for the time. The army was capable of long and rapid marches, sustained by a network of supply depots and efficient organization for foraging and transporting resources. Discipline in the Assyrian army was legendary and brutal. Constant training, severe punishments for disobedience, and generous rewards for bravery ensured troop cohesion and morale. The ideology of Ashur's divine mandate imbued soldiers with a sacred purpose, making them not just warriors, but instruments of divine will. The king's propaganda, with explicit descriptions of tortures and massacres, also served to harden the troops and instill in them the certainty that cruelty was a necessary virtue in war. Ashurnasirpal II's army was not just a fighting force. It was a symbol of the terror his king wanted to instill. Every victory, every razed city, every pile of skulls erected was a testament to its invincibility. This perfected and relentless war machine was the engine that allowed Ashurnasirpal to build an unprecedented empire of terror and control in the ancient Near East, ensuring that little resistance could stand before his advance. The magnificence of Ashurnasirpal II was not limited to battlefields or piles of skulls. It was meticulously woven into the narratives that would perpetuate his memory. The royal annals already mentioned were the central pillar, but the consecration of the king's name was a much more comprehensive process, a way of ensuring his legacy was indelible, and his fame as the king who imposed terror was etched into the very rock of history. This process involved glorifying his conquests, building imposing monuments, and creating an image that transcended the mortal to approach the divine. Royal inscriptions were the primary tool of this consecration, carved on obelisks, stelae, and most spectacularly on the walls of his northwest palace in Kalhu, Nimrud. These inscriptions were monumental texts that not only listed his military campaigns and conquered lands, but described them with an epic and triumphant tone. Every victory was celebrated as an act of divine power, a direct result of the intervention of the god Ashur, whose faithful servant Ashurnasirpal was. He was the king of the universe, the king of the four regions, the shepherd of Ashur who fulfills his will. This grandiose titling reinforced his legitimacy and his almost superhuman status. The texts spared no detail about the destruction inflicted upon enemies. Atrocities, impalements, flayings, blindings, massacres, and mass deportations were described with brutal frankness. These passages, though shocking to the modern reader, were to the audience of the time proof of divine justice and the king's relentless determination. By narrating the suffering of those who opposed him, Ashurnasirpal consolidated his reputation as a just tyrant, ensuring that the fear of his name was as potent a weapon as his army. With every graphic detail, the message was reinforced. Resisting Assyria was choosing annihilation. In addition to the annals, the monumental architecture of Kalhu itself served as a form of consecration. The vast palace halls, filled with bas-reliefs illustrating his campaigns, battles, and hunts, were a gallery of visual propaganda. These artworks were not merely decorative, they told the king's story to those who saw them: foreign dignitaries, Assyrian subjects, and delegations of vassals. The war scenes, with the Assyrians always victorious and enemies subjugated or massacred, were a vivid representation of his power. Ashurnasirpal's figures, always imposing and heroic, dominated these visual narratives, showing him as a fearless warrior, a skilled hunter, and a pious leader for Ashur. The construction of temples and the performance of religious rituals were also essential parts of the consecration. Ashurnasirpal presented himself as a temple builder and a guardian of the faith, ensuring that the gods favored him and legitimized his reign. The famous Banquet of Kalhu, which celebrated the inauguration of the new capital, was the apex of this public consecration, an event of opulence and power that gathered thousands of guests from across the empire and distant lands, witnessing Ashurnasirpal's magnificence and vast influence. In sum, the consecration of Ashurnasirpal II's name was a multifaceted propaganda campaign. He used the power of the written word, visual art, monumental architecture, and public rituals to create an image of himself as the ideal Assyrian monarch, a ruthless warrior, a capable administrator, a pious servant of the gods, and the builder of an unprecedented empire. His name, and the stories of his brutality and glory, were now eternally carved in the Assyrian Roll of Kings and in the memory of the peoples of the Near East. While Ashurnasirpal II's reign is widely known for its military brutality, it would be a mistake to view him solely as a conqueror who relied exclusively on brute force. In reality, Ashurnasirpal was a master of the diplomacy of threat, a shrewd strategy that extended Assyrian influence far beyond the immediate reach of his weapons. He understood that terror, once established, could be a more effective and, in the long run, less costly diplomatic tool than incessant warfare. The fear his name inspired was an emissary as powerful as any shock troop, capable of compelling submission without a single blow being struck. The essence of Ashurnasirpal's diplomacy lay in his reputation. The stories of his massacres, impalements, and total destruction of cities were deliberately disseminated by messengers, spies, and even survivors of his campaigns. The goal was to create an atmosphere of dread that would make neighboring kingdoms and potential challengers consider submission as the only sensible alternative to annihilation. For many rulers, the choice was clear: pay heavy tributes and swear vassalage, or face the full wrath of the Assyrian army with all its horrific consequences. This choice was, in fact, an imposition. The mere approach of the Assyrian army was often enough for cities to open their gates and for their leaders to present themselves to pay tribute, as seen in the Mediterranean campaign. The wealthy Phoenician cities, for example, preferred to present Ashurnasirpal with vast quantities of gold, silver, and cedar, rather than risk the fate of their populations and their commercial prosperity. This was a victory without battle, a testament to the success of the diplomacy of threat. The king received these tributes with pomp, recording them in his annals as proof of his supremacy and as an example for others who might hesitate. Ashurnasirpal also used diplomacy to isolate enemies. He could form temporary alliances with smaller kingdoms, promising protection or commercial benefits in exchange for their loyalty against a larger common enemy. Once the main enemy was neutralized, these allies could easily be transformed into vassals or absorbed into the empire. Furthermore, the presence of Assyrian governors and intelligence agents in vassal territories ensured that any sign of insubordination or the formation of anti-Assyrian alliances was quickly detected and reported to the king, allowing for a preemptive response. Maintaining a network of outposts and fortresses on the empire's borders also served as a constant reminder of Assyrian military capability and a starting point for swift reprisals. Power was not only exercised in battles, but was always present, latent, a constant threat to anyone considering disobedience. This policy created an Assyrian peace in vast regions, a peace enforced by coercion and fear, which benefited Assyria with a constant flow of resources without the need for constant large-scale mobilizations. In summary, Ashurnasirpal II's diplomacy was the softer, or less bloody side of his reign, a strategic complement to military terror. He used the fame of his atrocities to create an environment of preemptive submission, ensuring that Assyrian influence extended far beyond the battlefields, making fear the most effective of his ambassadors. The impact of his reputation was as devastating as the advance of his armies. For King Ashurnasirpal II, conquest and terror were not merely political or military acts. They were direct manifestations of the will of the gods, especially the supreme god Ashur. The religious legitimacy of conquest was a fundamental pillar of his reign and of Assyrian imperial ideology. The Assyrians saw themselves as the chosen people of Ashur, with the divine mission to extend his dominion and impose cosmic order on a chaotic world. This belief not only justified brutality, but elevated it to a sacred duty. Ashur, the patron deity of the city bearing his name and the head of the Assyrian pantheon, was a warrior god. He was depicted wielding a bow or spear, accompanied by mythical creatures or with wings, symbolizing his omnipotence and his ability to destroy and protect. The ideology dictated that the Assyrian king was the high priest of Ashur, his earthly representative, and that all military campaigns were, in essence, holy wars, jihad in a broader Semitic context, intended to expand the territory under Ashur's influence. When Ashurnasirpal marched to war, he did so under Ashur's standard, with prayers and rituals that invoked divine blessing and victory. Ashurnasirpal's royal inscriptions are replete with references to this divine legitimation. He described himself as the beloved of Ashur, the one who fulfills Ashur's will, the shepherd of Ashur. Every victory was attributed to the strength and guidance of Ashur and other important deities, such as the storm god Adad, who brought rain for crops but also devastating storms to enemies, and the goddess Ishtar, goddess of love, but also of war and fertility. The defeat of enemies was not just a military triumph, but proof of the superiority of the Assyrian gods over the deities of the conquered lands. This religious legitimation provided a moral justification for cruelty. Massacres, impalements, deportations, and the destruction of cities were presented not as acts of barbarity, but as the just and divine punishment for those who had rebelled against Ashur's will. By flaying the skin of enemy leaders or piling their heads, Ashurnasirpal was not merely terrifying. He was executing a divine judgment, purifying the land of impiety and disobedience. Looted treasures and received tributes were often dedicated to the temples of Ashur and other deities, symbolizing that the empire's wealth was, ultimately, a divine offering. Priests played a crucial role in this system, interpreting omens, performing rituals, and prophesying the success of campaigns. They were an integral part of the royal court and the war machine. The construction of new temples and the restoration of ancient sanctuaries, as part of Ashurnasirpal's vast construction projects in Kalhu, were also acts of devotion that reinforced the king's connection with the gods and his legitimacy as divinely appointed sovereign. The belief in Ashur's divine authority over the king and the empire was a unifying force for the Assyrian people, imbuing their actions with a sacred purpose and making war not only a necessity, but a virtue. Ashurnasirpal II, with his ruthlessness and his declared devotion to Ashur, embodied this ideology to the fullest, transforming faith into a potent tool for conquest and terror, ensuring that Ashur's name was as feared as the king's own. Despite his fame as the architect of terror, Ashurnasirpal II's reign was not based solely on military conquest and brutality. For the vast Assyrian territory to remain cohesive and productive, efficient administrative expansion was fundamental, ensuring that the newly conquered and consolidated empire was governed in a solid and centralized manner. Ashurnasirpal understood that brute force could conquer lands, but bureaucracy and organization were essential to maintain them. He perfected the Assyrian system of government, creating a structure that, though rigid and based on obedience, allowed for the effective exploitation of resources and the maintenance of order. Ashurnasirpal's empire was administered through a hybrid system of directly controlled provinces and vassal states. Provinces were annexed territories, governed directly by Assyrian governors, Shakinmati or Belpahate, appointed by the king. These governors, typically military officials or trusted members of the nobility, were responsible for collecting tributes, recruiting local troops for the Assyrian army, maintaining order, administering justice, and overseeing construction projects. They were the king's hands throughout the empire, and their loyalty was ensured by regular inspections and the threat of severe punishments for corruption or insubordination. Vassal states, on the other hand, were kingdoms that had submitted to Assyrian sovereignty, paying tributes and swearing loyalty, but maintaining a certain internal autonomy under their own rulers. However, this autonomy was superficial. Assyria maintained military garrisons at strategic points within these kingdoms, and Assyrian supervisors were frequently dispatched to ensure that the terms of vassalage were met. The Assyrian military presence was a constant reminder of imperial authority and a deterrent to any attempt at rebellion. Ashurnasirpal was a master at using the threat of his army to ensure the compliance of these vassals. Communication was vital for administering such a vast empire. The Assyrians developed a system of royal roads and an efficient network of messengers who traveled by horse or chariot, who could deliver dispatches quickly between the capital and the most distant provinces. This allowed the king to receive timely information about revolts or enemy movements and send his orders to his vast administrative apparatus. The collection of intelligence about neighboring kingdoms and potential hotbeds of resistance was also a priority, with spies and informants operating throughout the Near East. The mass deportation of conquered populations, while a tool of terror, also served an administrative purpose. By dispersing peoples and resettling them in different regions, Assyria not only diluted the ethnic and cultural identity that could foment rebellions, but also utilized this labor force to colonize new agricultural lands or for the grand construction projects, such as the building of Kalhu, Nimrud, the empire's new administrative capital. This redistribution of populations was a form of large-scale social engineering, aiming for greater cohesion and loyalty to the empire. In essence, Ashurnasirpal II was not just a general, he was a shrewd administrator. He created a solid empire not only through the brutality of conquest, but through the effectiveness of his bureaucracy. Terror, for him, was not an end, but a means to ensure obedience and the functioning of an administrative system that drained wealth and resources from a vast territory, funding continuous Assyrian glory. Under his iron fist, the Assyrian Empire became a well-oiled machine of governance and exploitation, a testament that order could indeed be forged in the fire of fear. Even after years of conquests and the consolidation of a vast empire, the later years of Ashurnasirpal II's campaigns, approximately from 870 BCE until his death in 859 BCE, were marked by a relentless persistence in maintaining Assyrian control and ascendancy. Far from retiring to the opulence of his new capital, Kalhu, Ashurnasirpal continued to lead expeditions, not so much for grand territorial expansions as in the early part of his reign, but to reassert authority, quell any signs of rebellion, and ensure the continuous flow of tribute. His objective was to leave his successor an indisputably dominant empire, whose borders were secure and whose reputation for terror was unshaken. These later campaigns were often punitive in nature, directed at vassal kingdoms that dared to delay tribute payments, or tribes that attempted to reclaim their independence in peripheral regions. The memory of previous years of brutality was a weapon, but Ashurnasirpal knew that fear needed to be periodically renewed, with tangible demonstrations of force. He continued to personally lead the army, a testament to his inexhaustible energy and his commitment to maintaining the discipline and effectiveness of his troops. His preferred routes were those he had already traveled, allowing him to consolidate supply lines and established military bases. Constant focus in these later years was the region along the Euphrates, especially to maintain control over lucrative trade routes and to intimidate any potential formation of anti-Assyrian coalitions by more distant kingdoms, such as those in the southern Levant and Babylonia. Although Babylonia was in a state of relative weakness, Ashurnasirpal never directly invaded it, preferring to maintain a posture of intimidation and indirect influence, perhaps respecting its religious importance or judging that direct conquest would be costly and risky. Instead, he focused on controlling the Aramean kingdoms surrounding Babylonia, limiting their maneuverability and ensuring they could not become a focal point of resistance. The eastern and northern mountains, with their independent and rebellious tribes, also demanded continuous attention. Campaigns against groups like the Nairi and other tribes in the Zagros Hills were often arduous, involving the pursuit of enemies over rugged terrain and the destruction of their bases. While these conquests were difficult to maintain permanently, regular expeditions served to extract tributes, plunder resources, and prevent these tribes from becoming an organized threat to Assyrian borders. The deportation of populations continued to be a common practice, redistributing labor and diluting the capacity for resistance. The royal annals continued to narrate these campaigns with the same grandiloquence and graphic details of atrocities, reinforcing the image of a king who never yielded and whose wrath remained as fierce as at the beginning of his reign. The maintenance of an always active army and readiness for war ensured that fear was a constant force throughout the empire. Ashurnasirpal II, until his dying day, remained the architect of terror, ensuring that his empire not only expanded but remained solid under the continuous threat of his iron fist. He ensured that, upon passing the throne to his son, Shalmaneser III, the latter would inherit an empire with secure borders, an abundant royal treasury, and a reputation for invincibility that would continue to terrorize the Near East for generations. For any monarch who built an empire through force and personal will, the question of succession represents one of the greatest and most dangerous challenges. For Ashurnasirpal II, the architect of terror, ensuring the continuity of his legacy and the stability of his vast empire after his death was of paramount importance. A reign so centered on the figure of a single individual ran the risk of crumbling if the transition of power was not smooth, and if his successor was not equally strong and capable of keeping the machine of terror and administration fully operational. Ashurnasirpal, a shrewd strategist, knew his empire had to outlive him. The choice of his successor fell upon his son, Shalmaneser III. Ashurnasirpal would have been dedicated to preparing Shalmaneser for the arduous task of governing Assyria. This would involve rigorous military training, with the young prince accompanying his father on campaigns to learn firsthand the tactics of war, the discipline of the army, and crucially, the application of brutality as a tool of governance. He would be exposed to the horrors of Assyrian warfare and methods of intimidation, ensuring he understood the essence of Assyrian terror. Shalmaneser's presence in some inscriptions and reliefs alongside his father suggests he was gradually integrated into royal activities, familiarizing himself with administration and diplomacy. Shalmaneser III's legitimacy was carefully constructed. He was publicly designated as the heir, and his position was affirmed through rituals and proclamations that directly linked him to Ashur's divine mandate, inherited from his father. This planned power transition aimed to avoid internal disputes and ensure that the powerful provincial governors, military chiefs, and priests of the empire recognized the new king's authority without hesitation. The memory of Ashurnasirpal himself and the fear of his wrath, even after death, would also serve to intimidate anyone contemplating challenging the succession. However, ensuring the continuity of the legacy did not depend solely on a strong successor. Ashurnasirpal had built a solid imperial structure that should be capable of operating even with a change in monarch. This included a centralized and effective administration, with loyal governors and officials established throughout the empire, a professional and well-trained army, whose loyalty was to the institution and dynasty, not just to an individual, an abundant royal treasury, filled with tributes and spoils, providing the necessary resources to sustain the empire without the need for immediate large-scale campaigns. The new capital of Kalhu, Nimrud, an imposing administrative and military center, designed to be the heart of the empire for generations. The ideology of terror and the supremacy of Ashur, deeply ingrained in the minds of his subjects and enemies. Ashurnasirpal, in his later years, did not content himself with resting on his laurels. His continuous campaigns aimed in part to leave a pacified by terror and economically prosperous empire for Shalmaneser. He removed any source of instability or potential rebellion and ensured that the tribute system was functioning perfectly. His death, which occurred around 859 BCE, marked the end of an extraordinary reign, but the empire he forged was robust enough to continue to prosper and expand under his son's leadership. The challenges of succession were thus overcome by Ashurnasirpal's strategic vision, which ensured that his legacy of terror and glory did not end with his life, but flourished under his heir's aegis. Among the most tangible and impressive legacies of Ashurnasirpal II, the founding and development of his new capital, Kalhu, known today as Nimrud, stands out as a colossal monument to his power and vision. Assur, the ancient religious capital, was no longer suitable for the ambitions of an expanding empire. Ashurnasirpal needed a city that would not only serve as an administrative and military center, but also be a physical and grand manifestation of his glory and the terror he had imposed. Kalhu would be that city, a megalomaniacal project that would consume vast resources and labor, transforming an insignificant village on the eastern bank of the Tigris River into one of the most spectacular cities of the ancient Near East. The choice of location was strategic. Kalhu was situated in a fertile area with easy access to the Tigris River and a confluence of trade routes, yet also defensible. Construction began early in his reign, around 879 BCE, and was an undertaking that lasted decades, requiring an army of workers. The labor force was predominantly composed of mass deportees, war captives and entire populations removed from conquered lands, who were forced to work in quarries, brick manufacturing, and construction. This use of captives to build the capital was, in itself, an act of terror and domination, turning the victims of conquest into the very architects of their captivity. The city was designed on a monumental scale, surrounded by imposing double walls, stretching for kilometers. Kalhu was an impregnable fortress, a symbol of security for the Assyrians and intimidation for enemies. Inside the walls, it housed not only a vast royal complex, but also grandiose temples dedicated to Ashur and other deities, army barracks, armories, warehouses, and residences for the Assyrian elite. The engineering involved in constructing irrigation canals to sustain the gardens and agricultural lands around the city was equally impressive, ensuring the capital's self-sufficiency. The focal point of Kalhu was Ashurnasirpal's northwest palace, a structure that rivaled in size and opulence any palace of antiquity. Its walls were adorned with thousands of meters of meticulously carved bas-reliefs, which narrated the king's military conquests, his heroic hunts, and religious rituals. These artworks were, first and foremost, visual propaganda, glorifying the monarch's image and terrifying those who gazed upon them. Gigantic sculptures of Lamassu, winged bulls or lions with human heads, guarded the palace entrances, symbols of power and divine protection. The founding of Kalhu was more than a construction project. It was a political and ideological act. It became the new administrative and military capital of the empire, the center from which Ashurnasirpal governed his vast conquests. The city was a safe haven for the king and his court, a gathering point for troops before campaigns, and a distribution hub for the immense treasures and spoils of war. For the Assyrian people, Kalhu was the materialization of their king's glory and their god Ashur. For enemies, it was a physical and terrifying reminder of Assyria's overwhelming power, an eternal monument to the architect of terror and his ability to transform brutality into stone and gold. Within the imposing walls of the new capital, Kalhu, Nimrud, rose the crown jewel of Ashurnasirpal II's architectural achievements, the Northwest Palace. More than a mere royal residence, this monumental structure was the physical embodiment of the king's absolute power and the Assyrian Empire. Designed to impress and intimidate, the palace was not just an administrative and residential center. It was a gigantic stone manifesto, a gallery of art and propaganda that celebrated Ashurnasirpal's conquests and terrorized his enemies. Its construction was a monumental effort, utilizing the labor of thousands of deportees and the resources drained from across the vast empire. The architecture of the Northwest Palace was impressive in scale and detail. It occupied a vast area within the citadel of Kalhu, with multiple courtyards, audience halls, royal apartments, harems, administrative offices, and storage rooms. The inner walls of the main corridors and halls were lined with kilometers of meticulously carved alabaster bas-reliefs. These artworks were not merely decorative, they formed a continuous visual narrative of the king's glory. The scenes depicted Ashurnasirpal in his military campaigns, sieges of cities, massacres of enemies, parades of prisoners, piles of heads, and the submission of subjugated peoples. He was shown as a fearless warrior, a hunter of lions and wild bulls, symbols of power, and a pious king in religious rituals. Every detail in the reliefs was calculated to reinforce the king's image as invincible and divinely sanctioned. The brutality of the punishments, impalements, flayings, tortures, was displayed without restraint, not to shock the Assyrians, but to serve as a permanent visual warning to anyone visiting the palace, especially ambassadors and vassal chiefs. Seeing these scenes carved in stone, accompanied by the cuneiform inscriptions that explained them in grim detail, was a visceral experience that reinforced the king's and the empire's reputation for terror. The palace entrances were guarded by gigantic lamassu sculptures, protective figures with the body of a bull or lion, eagle wings, and a human head, often bearing the king's own face. Weighing tens of tons, these sculptures were not only artistically impressive, they were a manifestation of power and a symbolic barrier against evil and enemies. Their massive presence, both at the entrance and in the corridors, created an atmosphere of reverence and dread. The Northwest Palace also served as the administrative center of the empire. From its offices, the king and his officials issued decrees, received reports from distant provinces, managed the vast tributes and war spoils, and planned future campaigns. It was a nerve center of intelligence, logistics, and military command. The royal apartments, though luxurious, also reflected the life of a monarch constantly engaged in state affairs. As a whole, the Northwest Palace of Kalhu was more than a structure. It was a declaration of power. It represented Ashurnasirpal's ability to transform the wealth of conquests into architectural magnificence, to use art as propaganda, and to build a home that was as grand and intimidating as the legend of his own reign. It served as a lasting testament that the architect of terror was not just a destroyer, but also a builder of an imperial civilization forged under his iron fist, a symbol of dominion that would echo for centuries. The walls of the Northwest Palace in Kalhu, Nimrud, built by Ashurnasirpal II, were more than mere surfaces. They were a monumental canvas for the most elaborate form of visual propaganda in antiquity, the bas-reliefs. These stone sculptures, covering kilometers of corridors and halls, were not just artworks. They were meticulously planned visual narratives designed to communicate the king's glory, the invincibility of the Assyrian army, and, unforgettably, the cruelty inherent in Assyrian conquest. For Ashurnasirpal, the image was as powerful as the written word or the sword. The themes of the bas-reliefs were predominantly military and royal. Scenes of war campaigns dominated the space, the Assyrian army marching relentlessly, sieges of cities with battering rams and assault towers, and pitched battles where enemies were crushed. Ashurnasirpal was always depicted in a central and heroic position, commanding his troops, firing his bow, or receiving the submission of conquered kings. His figure, usually larger than others, symbolized his superiority and divine authority. The meticulous representation of each type of Assyrian soldier, their weapons and equipment, and their battle formations also served to demonstrate the organization and effectiveness of his war machine. However, what makes these reliefs so infamous and powerful as propaganda is the explicit representation of Assyrian brutality and cruelty. Artists did not hesitate to show the consequences of resistance, scenes of massacres where enemies were decapitated or impaled, piles of heads erected as trophies, prisoners being flayed alive, and entire populations being led away in deportation, carrying their few belongings. These graphic images were accompanied by cuneiform inscriptions that detailed the atrocities, often in Ashurnasirpal's own words. I impaled many of them on stakes. I flayed the skins of many, and covered the city pillars with their skins. This exhibition of horror was not primarily intended to shock Assyrian subjects who were already accustomed to the violence of war. Its purpose was to terrorize foreign visitors, especially ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms and chiefs of vassal peoples who were forced to witness the magnificence and the ruthless reality of Assyrian power. It was a form of visual psychological warfare. By seeing the depiction of the fate awaiting challengers, visitors were reminded of the futility of resistance and the wisdom in remaining submissive. The reliefs were a lasting warning, a promise of annihilation to anyone who dared defy the king's will. In addition to scenes of war and terror, the reliefs also depicted royal hunts, where Ashurnasirpal was shown killing lions and wild bulls. These scenes were not just entertainment. They symbolized the king's ability to impose order over chaos, in both the natural and political worlds. He was the shepherd who protected his flock, the Assyrians, and the hunter who eliminated the beasts, the enemies. In summary, the bas-reliefs of Ashurnasirpal II in the Northwest Palace were a sophisticated and brutal form of imperial propaganda. They transformed cruelty into art and conquest into an epic visual narrative. By unreservedly exposing the barbarity of his campaigns, Ashurnasirpal not only solidified his own image as the architect of terror, but also ensured that the fear of his empire would be perpetuated in the stones of his glorious capital, echoing for millennia. At the peak of his reign, around 879 BCE, after years of intense military campaigns and the completion of much of his new and glorious capital, Kalhu, Nimrud, Ashurnasirpal II organized an unprecedented event, the royal banquet of Kalhu. This was no mere party. It was a monumental celebration of power and submission, a grand spectacle designed to display the opulence, magnificence, and overwhelming dominion of the Assyrian king over a vast empire. The inscriptions detailing the banquet are one of the richest sources of information about life at the Assyrian court and Ashurnasirpal's imperial mindset. The purpose of the banquet was twofold: to officially inaugurate the new capital and its magnificent Northwest Palace, and crucially to reassert Assyrian hegemony before an audience composed of thousands of guests. The guest list was impressive and deliberately chosen. It included Assyrian nobles, generals, officials, priests, but also, and perhaps most importantly, thousands of ambassadors and chiefs from vassal states and distant kingdoms who had been compelled to come and witness Ashurnasirpal's glory. It was a demonstration of his ability to gather representatives from across the known world under his aegis. The scale of the banquet was colossal. Ashurnasirpal boasted in his inscriptions of having fed no fewer than 69,574 people for 10 days. The detailed provisions are equally impressive: 1,000 oxen, 1,000 calves, 10,000 sheep, 1,000 lambs, 1,000 geese, 1,000 ducks, 1,000 various birds, 10,000 fish, 10,000 eggs, 10,000 jars of beer, 10,000 jars of wine, countless baskets of fruit, honey, oil, vegetables, and spices. This vast quantity of food not only demonstrated the wealth and resources the king could mobilize, much of which came from plunder and tributes, but also his forced generosity, which was an Assyrian royal virtue. The banquet was an event of great pomp and ceremony. Guests were entertained with music, dance, and likely displays of military might and royal hunts. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but also of an underlying tension, especially for foreign envoys. They walked through the corridors of the Northwest Palace, whose walls were adorned with the terrifying bas-reliefs depicting the massacres, tortures, and deportations that had visited their own peoples or those of their neighbors. The banquet, therefore, was an act of hospitality mixed with subtle psychological warfare, reminding all present of the source of that opulence and the price of disobedience. The banquet of Kalhu was a spectacular success in terms of propaganda. It solidified Ashurnasirpal II's image as a king of unparalleled power and wealth, a true king of the universe. By forcing the presence of his vassals and enemies at this festival of grandeur, he reinforced the message that Assyria was the center of the world, and that all other kingdoms were, in one way or another, under his influence. The celebration was not just a feast for the senses, but a triumph of imperial will, a vivid and terrifying reminder that peace and prosperity within the empire were forged in submission and fear. The banquet was the culmination of his domination strategy, where terror disguised itself as festivity to cement Assyrian control. The legacy of Ashurnasirpal II did not end with his death. In fact, his strategy of systematic brutality became a core doctrine and a model of conduct for the Assyrian kings who succeeded him. He not only used terror as a tool, but elevated it to a lasting influence on future Assyrian tactics, cementing the Neo-Assyrian Empire's reputation as the most feared and ruthless power in the Near East for centuries. The policy of the architect of terror became the norm, a grim inheritance that would be continued and, at times, even enhanced by his descendants. His son and successor, Shalmaneser III, closely followed in his father's footsteps. Shalmaneser's inscriptions, though perhaps not as graphically detailed as Ashurnasirpal's, continued to report massacres, destruction of cities, impalements, and mass deportations. The famous image of Shalmaneser III's black obelisk, depicting subjugated kings, including Jehu of Israel, prostrating before him and offering tribute, is a direct continuation of the visual propaganda of power and submission that Ashurnasirpal had established in Kalhu. The doctrine that resistance would result in annihilation and the widespread fear it provoked continued to be the driving force behind the swift submissions of many kingdoms. Later kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, the great monarchs of the empire's zenith, continued to employ and, in some cases, expand the tactics of terror initiated by Ashurnasirpal. Sennacherib, for example, is famous for his total destruction of Babylon in 689 BCE, and for his accounts of massacres in Jerusalem, though that city did not fall. Ashurbanipal boasted of drinking from goblets made from the skulls of his enemies and hanging captured leaders. The continuity was not just in the cruelty of the actions, but in how they were used as a deliberate policy of psychological warfare. The theological justification for this brutality also persisted. The idea that Assyrian wars were the will of Ashur, the warrior god who sanctioned the punishment of the wicked and rebellious, continued to be the fundamental belief guiding Assyrian kings. The royal annals of each successor mimicked Ashurnasirpal's style, with grandiose descriptions of victories and the suffering inflicted upon the vanquished, ensuring that the propaganda of terror was continuous and immutable. Ashurnasirpal II's legacy of brutality shaped how the Neo-Assyrian Empire was perceived by its contemporaries and how it is remembered by history. While effective in his time for consolidating power and extracting wealth, this policy of terror also generated deep and lasting resentment among subjugated peoples. This accumulated hatred would surface centuries later as the Assyrian Empire weakened, contributing in part to its eventual and total destruction by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. Thus, Ashurnasirpal not only built an empire, he built a paradigm of empire by terror. He taught his successors that the most complete obedience would come not from loyalty, but from the paralyzing fear of annihilation. This influence on future Assyrian tactics ensures that, even millennia later, Ashurnasirpal II remains the archetypal figure of the architect of terror, whose cruelty was both his greatest weapon and, ultimately, one of the seeds of his own downfall. When Ashurnasirpal II died in 859 BCE, he left his son and successor, Shalmaneser III, an empire with unprecedented stability, a peace brutally imposed and maintained through a policy of systematic terror. The kingdom he inherited in 883 BCE was ambitious but still contested on its borders. The empire he bequeathed was the undisputed and dominant power of the Near East, a colossus forged not only in military conquest, but in the terrifying memory of his atrocities. This was a different kind of stability than the Roman peace, based not on law or voluntary cultural assimilation, but on the paralyzing fear of Assyrian retaliation. The main characteristic of this stability was forced obedience. Vassal kingdoms, subjugated cities, and mountain tribes that had previously challenged Assyrian authority now paid their tributes regularly and punctually. The mere threat of a new Assyrian campaign was enough to ensure compliance. The memory of piles of skulls, Impalements, razed cities, and mass deportations was fresh in the minds of the peoples, and this memory was the most effective of tax collectors and guardians of order. Ashurnasirpal had made the cost of disobedience so prohibitive that submission, however burdensome, seemed the only reasonable option for survival. Economically, the empire prospered. The vast plunder and spoils of war, combined with the continuous flow of tributes of gold, silver, metals, cattle, and precious timbers, filled Assyrian coffers. This wealth funded not only the luxury of the court and the maintenance of a large army, but also the monumental construction projects such as the new capital, Kalhu, Nimrud. The economic centralization in Assyria's hands ensured that the resources of a vast territory were drained to the empire's center, strengthening its position of power. Vital trade routes, extending from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, were now firmly under Assyrian control, guaranteeing the security of caravans and the flow of goods. Administratively, the empire was well organized. The network of Assyrian governors and the presence of military garrisons at strategic points ensured that the king's authority was exercised in all provinces. Mass deportations, besides being an instrument of terror, also served to redistribute populations and labor, diluting regional identities and creating a more heterogeneous society, and, therefore, less prone to coordinated rebellions. This policy of mixing peoples aimed to create a new imperial identity, albeit forcibly imposed. The Assyrian war machine was at the peak of its efficiency, well-trained and always ready for campaign. Ashurnasirpal had left an army with a reputation for invincibility, led by experienced generals and with access to the most advanced siege and combat technology. The ideology of Ashur's divine mandate, which justified conquest and brutality as sacred acts, was deeply ingrained, providing legitimacy and purpose to the empire. The stability forged by Ashurnasirpal II was not a peace desired by the subjugated peoples, but a graveyard peace, where the absence of revolt was the absence of life. However, for Assyria, this was glory. He had transformed his kingdom into an indisputable power, an empire where the word Assyria was synonymous with might, and above all, with fear. This legacy of a solid empire under terror would be the foundation for the future expansions of his successors and the indelible mark of his reign in ancient history. With the death of Ashurnasirpal II in 859 BCE and the ascension of his son Shalmaneser III, the Near East did not return to a previous state of equilibrium. On the contrary, the waves of Assyrian terror that Ashurnasirpal had created continued to spread and profoundly shape the political and economic landscape of the region for centuries. Assyria, under Shalmaneser and his successors, not only maintained its hegemony but consolidated and expanded it further, utilizing the foundations of brutality and efficiency built by Ashurnasirpal. Politically, Assyria was now the undisputed and dominant power. Kingdoms that had been subjugated by Ashurnasirpal, such as those in Syria, Anatolia, and the Zagros Mountains, remained as vassal states or were directly incorporated as Assyrian provinces. Ashurnasirpal's reputation for cruelty served as a powerful deterrent to any attempt at rebellion. Shalmaneser III, though a great general in his own right, did not need to reinvent terror. He simply inherited it and applied it. Siege tactics, massacres, deportations, and the visual propaganda of Assyrian power continued to be employed, maintaining the Assyrian peace forged in fear. Babylonia remained in a state of relative weakness, and, while not directly annexed by Ashurnasirpal or Shalmaneser, stayed within the Assyrian sphere of influence, with frequent interventions to support pro-Assyrian kings or to suppress tribal incursions. The network of Assyrian governors and forts established by Ashurnasirpal remained and was expanded, ensuring firm administrative control over vast territories. The Assyrian military presence was constant, and effective communication between the capital, Kalhu, and the provinces ensured that any focus of instability was quickly contained. The policy of mass deportations continued, drastically altering the demographics of various regions and diluting local ethnic identities, making the organization of large-scale rebellions more difficult. Economically, the empire was at the height of its prosperity, though this prosperity was unidirectional. Tributes of gold, silver, natural resources, and manufactured goods flowed incessantly into Assyria. Vital trade routes were firmly controlled, and Assyria became the center of a vast trade network, benefiting from the forced peace it had imposed. The accumulated wealth not only sustained the luxury of the court and military might, but also funded the expansion of Kalhu and the construction of other Assyrian cities, transforming the urban landscape of the empire's heartland. Ashurnasirpal's pattern of plunder, followed by tribute, established an economic model that ensured the continuous extraction of resources from subjugated peoples. Ashurnasirpal's influence was also felt in imperial ideology. The divine justification for conquest and brutality, centered on the god Ashur, remained the fundamental belief guiding Assyrian kings. The visual propaganda in palaces and royal inscriptions continued to glorify the king as the executor of divine will, celebrating cruelty as a necessary virtue for order. However, the waves of terror also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The deep resentment accumulated by the subjugated peoples, who had suffered the atrocities of Ashurnasirpal and his successors, would not vanish. This latent hatred, though suppressed by fear, would surface much later when the Assyrian Empire weakened, contributing to its ultimate downfall. Ashurnasirpal's legacy, therefore, was that of an empire of unparalleled power, but also that of a model of domination that, in the end, would be its own undoing, leaving a trail of terror that would echo through history and shape the destiny of an entire region.